It's a real pleasure and an honor to have Dr. Manesh Girn with us today. Manesh and I have been sort of collaborating to some extent over the years. He's been very generous with his time, bringing his expertise to our trainings. And so I'm actually going to turn off this chime here. Okay, there we go. Great. So, yeah, Manish is really at the forefront of psychedelic neuroscience research. And it's really excited to have him on to discuss topics related to mysticism and spirituality. Hi, Parham. So, yeah, it's a real pleasure. And yeah, over the years, Manesh has gone from doing his PhD studies at McGill University, which is where we met, and now he's at UCSF, working in the lab of Dr. Robin Card Harris, who is one of the leading researchers in the world. From a personal level, also, I really respect Manish's sort of knowledge on topics related to spirituality outside of necessarily like psychedelic science. So I'm really happy to have you to be able to bridge sort of all these areas. Manish, I'll let you introduce yourself as well, and really excited to host you for the hour.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for inviting me on to here. Yeah, as Houman mentioned, I'm currently working at UCSF. I'm a postdoc and doing work with Robin Hard Harris. And my background mainly, well, my PhD is in neuroscience. So I'm a neuroscientist. And my research at UCSF, we're looking at psilocybin mainly, basically characterizing in more detail its brain mechanisms in humans. And we have several projects that we're doing. One that's particularly interesting that we're just wrapping up actually is we want to look at how individuals vary in their brain responses to psychedelics and how we can characterize at an individual level how their brain effects and psychological experience changes across successive experiences. And so we're really just trying to push the needle in understanding with nuance how people's brains are responding to these drugs and how that could be relevant to predicting outcomes in terms of psychedelic therapy and just understanding in more detail the nature of the psychedelic experience and the type of experiences like we can undergo and how they might relate to the brain.
Thank you so much. And so this is using functional MRI imaging mainly. Is that the main modality?
Yeah, so I'm mainly a functional MRI researcher, but we do fMRI and EEG in the lab.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, one of the ways in which I really got interested in psychedelic science was when I looked at the first images comparing some functional imaging with LSD users and meditators and sort of that bridge between meditation and contemplative practices. And the psychedelic state was really interesting for me. And I guess it'll be interesting just to quickly talk about the fMRI and like explain what it shows. And then the part where you correlate with EEG is very interesting for me. It's something that I know less about. If you can explain how that works, that'll be amazing.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of exciting research with fMRI on psychedelics, like the LC paper you mentioned, which came out in 2016 by Robin Harris, my supervisor. So, we've been finding a lot of different effects with fMRI. Psychedelics are really complex in how they affect the brain, and they basically affect the entire brain. It's not like, oh, they only affect this one region of the brain or this one network. They really affect how the whole brain as a whole processes information and functions. And there are a couple of reliable signatures within that. One is that basically the whole brain becomes more integrated. And so usually the brain functions in a way where there's these distinct modules or networks which are differentiated from each other, right? So there's like a network that is involved in visual perception, another one like the default mode network, which we can talk about, involved in thinking, abstract thinking, and the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and the world, stuff related to attention. Usually these are pretty distinct as they need to be to help us interface with the external world and our lives. But under psychedelics, these start to become less integrated with themselves and more with each other. So everything is blending together much more. You're getting visual networks intermixed with regions related to memory. So our kind of our memories and thought processes are somehow spilling into the external world because these networks are no longer distinct. You get auditory areas mixing with visual where you hear something and you're like, oh, that really sounds like green right now, right? And you get this weird synesthesia type effects. And so brain becomes more integrated. And another interesting thing is that when it's more integrated, it just has more states it can enter into. And so the brain is basically entering entering into this expanded set of brain states, which correspond to all the new experiences that we undergo under a psychedelic that we don't in our everyday life. And so we get this integrated, diverse and complex and entropic mode of brain functioning. Where we're making connections between things. We're exploring new perspectives, new lines of thought, having random images and memories come up and all these things. And so we can trace that into these kind of brain processes.
And how do you correlate that with the EEG findings?
So EEG is interesting. So fMRI is really good because you can say this region is changing in this way, right? You get very spatially specific. You can say things about specific brain regions. EEG, you can do that less, but EEG is very precise over time. Whereas fMRI, you get samples every 2 seconds or so most of the time. EEG, you get at the level of milliseconds, which needs rapid, views. And with EEG, you can look at how brain waves change. People have heard of things like alpha waves or gamma, et cetera. And you can also look more closely at how the signal changes over time. And so in studies with EEG, we're finding that one of the most reliable signature of things like ego dissolution and even visual effects is a reduction in our alpha brain waves. So alpha brain waves, one of the things they do is they kind of um, they mediate what's important and what's not important. Or, if you have high alpha area, it usually means that it's suppressing that information. Um, and allowing, like, for example, when we close our eyes, we get high alpha because alpha is going to reduce our awareness of the external world in place of the internal. So alpha is kind of related to this kind of memory-based internal processing. Anyway, psychedelics disrupt that really potently. And this correlates with ego dissolution, which makes us forget what is internal, what's external, and we're blending with things. And so with our studies, we want to see how these EEG signatures relate to the fMRI and how that relates to subjective experiences, just to get a broader picture of what's going on.
That's fascinating. Um, if I want to try to get a visual of what a research participant experiences, so are they sitting in an MRI machine on psilocybin for like 5, 6 hours, or how does that work?
So right now, it varies. I could talk like in typical studies, right? They usually will do the psilocybin and then they'll like hang out outside of the scanner until they're peaking. And then they'll go in the scanner for 10 minutes during the peak. And we'll get, oh, this is the peak experience. And we'll maybe get 10 to 20. But with our study we're doing right now, it's the most comprehensive because we're putting them in there for 15 minutes. Well, actually, yeah, a total of 45 minutes every few hours, right? So like we're getting 45-minute snapshot right at the beginning of the trip. We're getting another snapshot at the peak and another snapshot at the end. So in that case, they're going in and out of the scanner. So they're going in for about an hour, coming out, relaxing a bit, going back in, out, back in. It's like, it's not the most fun to be tripping on mushrooms going through this, and but people do it. And actually, what we're doing is fMRI for an hour, take them out, EEG cap for 10 minutes, take the cap off, go back to the scanner, and do that 3 times. And so we're going pretty hardcore with this study. That's we're getting like a lot of data. But we don't put them in there for the entire trip. That's a bit too intense.
Interesting. Um, and so I wonder how that sort of setting influences the experience. Have you been with patients like while they're having this experience, going into the MRI and such?
Yeah, yes, I've run a number of people through this process I'm mentioning, and things vary. People vary in how they respond to it. Some people, yeah, like, not having the most fun time at the beginning. They're kind of frustrated and annoyed by it. But usually they kind of get into a flow, and then are okay with it eventually. It's kind of like a transition into that and like acclimating to it. It's interesting that some people, because we scan them off drug first and then on drug, some people prefer to be in the scanner on psilocybin than not.
Like there's a lag here.
There
Okay,
we
you're
go.
back.
I mean, basically, I was making the point. It's kind of unpredictable how somebody's going to deal with it, and sometimes people like being in the scanner on psilocybin. It's kind of like this cozy, dark place, and you're just by yourself. So it's interesting.
Very interesting. And I don't know how many people here have had an MRI, but the sounds are quite striking. Is that what they hear? Because I know there's technology now where they can play music, but are they hearing MRI sounds when they're in there?
So yes, well, they have like earplugs in and like headphones on, so it's like all noise canceling. But the thing is, listening to music will change the brain effects, and we're interested in what's like the pure psychedelic experience, it's spontaneous and natural. So we have the capability to give them music, but we don't, right? So they're in there and just with their thoughts and the sounds that are naturally happening.
Okay, so it's more silent than there's like noise canceling, so they're not hearing that MRI magnetic sort of sound
Yeah,
normally.
it still seeps through because it's extremely loud, but it's like pretty muffled. It's not like it's easier to tune out.
Great. Super fascinating. I think it's worth it to just give us a quick overview of where we're at with the neuroscience of psychedelics. You mentioned entropic states, you mentioned default mode network, and I know there's sort of Gouldolin's work with the critical periods. I'm wondering if you can give us just like an overview of where we're at with our understanding of the psychedelic experience.
Yeah, so in terms of neuroscience of psychedelics, there's like the rodent research and in vitro and the preclinical, right? In terms of um like not working with humans, you could say. And then there's human research. And so those are very different fields, right? There are very different labs, different people doing slightly different questions. And so on the preclinical side, the main push is trying to characterize in more detail neuroplasticity and the mechanisms at the molecular cellular level that contribute to neuroplasticity, that contribute to antidepressant or therapeutic effects, and that contribute to the experience and of looking at whether those are dissociable, right? And so there's a lot of work on that. And so, we're currently at the place where it seems pretty reliable that psychedelics induce neuroplasticity. They promote the growth of dendrites in neurons, which allow new connections with other neurons. This seems to last up to 30 days plus in some studies. You see this neuronal growth. And okay, so that's seems to be more or less the case, although there are some caveats and criticisms there based on how it's studied. That's certainly the idea. And then so a lot of work there is trying to ask the question, can we get that neuroplastic boost without inducing a trip in people, right? And that is, can we somehow activate the receptors in a way that you get one without the other? So can we distinguish them? Or is the experience inextricably tied to neuroplasticity, right? And other effects. And so there's a lot of work on that, looking at these very, nuanced, G protein coupled receptor mechanisms, which I won't get into. It's a bit too technical, but they're exploring that and trying to develop novel molecules which affect only certain sub pathways. So that's kind of preclinical. I'm like a human researcher, and so we're looking at rather than individual neurons and cells and molecules, we're looking at the brain as a whole, brain regions, brain networks, how they interact. And at that level, a lot of the research has suggested, yes, the brain as a whole becomes more integrated, more entropic. But thing is, it's the details that matter here. And what's interesting is that, sure, we hear a lot of talk about specific brain networks, such as the default mode network. But thing is, psychedelics affect basically every network in the brain, and a lot of networks more than the default mode network. And so we know that psychedelics affect these brain networks, and we can kind of speculate that they're probably related to X, Y, and Z experiences. The link between experiences and certain brain changes in humans is still relatively weak. because you need really large studies to have those correlations in a reliable way. And so, a lot of people think default mode network, which is very briefly involved in our sense of ego, our sense of narrative self, story we tell ourselves, but also it's involved in all types of abstract thinking. We conceptualize about our life and the world and understand other people's mental states and create these frameworks. And so they're like, oh, like that's probably reduced in our psychedelics when we have these ego death experiences. But strictly speaking, empirically, that hasn't been definitively shown in a reliable way. And so we're really kind of still trying to find these links between experience, phenomenology on one side, and then brain effects. And also, we're realizing more and more, as I was kind of alluding to, people respond very differently. Like you give one person the same dose of psilocybin, give another person the same dose in the MRI, both in the same context, and their brains can even show opposite patterns when averaged over time, or like completely different exploration of the brain states. So then it's like, okay, what are we really looking at when we're averaging across 30 people in these studies? There's so much variability. And how can we understand what contributes to that variability? And then maybe that can help kind of precision medicine approaches where this person with X brain state at time point one is likely going to benefit from psychedelics at time point three. It's like, so we're exploring that in the neuroimaging as well, in the human side.
Very interesting. Yeah, I know that there is this push also to create, um, drugs essentially that will have the same downstream effect of the psychedelics without having the psychedelic experience. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, and if you can tell us like where that research is at this time.
So, I mean, it's interesting. So this research is done in rodents where they're trying to, as I was saying before, to dissociate therapeutic and neuroplastic effects from the experience. The thing is, like mice can't tell you that they're tripping or not, right? And so it's like, okay, so what's the proxy of psychedelic experiences in rodents? And it's funny, it's this head twitch response, as it's called. They like shake their head in this weird way like this, in a way they usually don't do. And they reliably do that with in a dose-dependent way with psychedelics. So then they're like, oh, this head twitch is a marker of psychedelic experiences. But the thing is, there are non-psychedelic drugs that can induce that twitch response, which are just based on the serotonin system. So it's like, what are we really looking at here? So it's like, with that said, there are studies using analogs of ibogaine, for example, or LSD, which seem to induce neuroplasticity and show some antidepressant effects in rodents and doesn't make them twitch their head. And then they're like from this, oh, like these probably are not going to make humans trip, but they're antidepressant and they're pro neuroplasticity. But again, like the translational validity of that is unclear, right? We're not clear if the lack of the head twitch really corresponds to them not tripping. And so there's a lot of hype around, yeah, non-psychedelic psychedelics, but those are based in these rodent studies, not in humans. There's nothing being tested in humans in a study yet that's published. And then you get into the nitty-gritty of in these rodents of characterizing, oh, like how is it that they're having these benefits without the experience? So it's supposedly, and then it gets into detail in the cellular and molecular mechanisms and different kind of intracellular pathways that could be induced through the serotonin 2A receptor that psychedelics target. And so right now, there's a lot of money, a lot of time and energy going towards this question in characterizing both, can you do that? Can you induce neuroplasticity without having the head twitch? And then how is that happening? And so that's ongoing, still unclear. Lots of questions there.
Amazing. So you keep referring back to neuroplasticity. I guess the idea where we are now is that the major benefit of the psychedelic experience is this neuroplasticity, this ability to change rigid patterns, that we're normally stuck in, and sort of create new pathways. Is that where we're sort of seeing the peak effect of psychedelics?
That's often, yes, assumed to be the case. This is tricky again because all the neuroplasticity stuff is based in rodents and in vitro cells in a dish. It's very hard to measure neuroplasticity reliably in humans, and that's an ongoing question on how to do that. And so like 99% of it is us making inferences based on rodents again. It's like, oh, this seems to be happening in rodents. We know neuroplasticity is beneficial in other contexts, therefore it must be neuroplasticity driving the effects in humans. I think it's a combination of factors, right? I think neuroplasticity, based on what we know about how it works, can help potentially give their brain more resources to make new connections, to then encode new behaviors and change how we approach things and restore functions that might have been lost, like emotional regulation skills and abilities. Um, but also, we can't reduce psychedelics. I think we can't reduce psychedelics to their brain effects. Psychedelics induce these profound experiences where people process deeply, deep emotions that haven't been processed for decades. They have insights into their life, their relationships. They have trauma that comes up that can then be processed and reconsolidated in potentially healthier ways. So there's a huge experiential component that if you ask anybody who goes through psychedelic therapy, they talk about the experience that they had, right? They talk about the profound insights and shifts psychologically that they had, which then translate into long-term benefits. So I think psychedelics are this synergy between the experiential and neurobiological effects, and we can't just exclusively focus on one at the expense of the others. But people seem to disagree because of kind of what I would say is longstanding biases in psychiatry of biological reductionism to reduce things to the brain and ignore experience. And there's a whole historical reason for that because current psychiatry, biological psychiatry, was a response to like Freudian and like, well, not just Freudian, but psychoanalysis. So they kind of absolved any association with subjective phenomena in psychoanalysis in the 50s or 60s. They're like, oh, we're a biological discipline, we're a part of rest of medicine. But they threw the baby out with the bathwater, right? And I think psychedelics are kind of bringing in, it's like, no, we need both. We can't just focus just on neuroplasticity, just on the brain. We gotta, or chemical imbalances or whatever you want to say. It has to be this experiential side too. And so I think psychedelics are a good example of that.
Thank you. Thanks for that. And I think that's the perfect segue into a topic that really interests me. And I think it's sort of obvious from the name of this venture, Mystic Health, that I have an interest in mysticism and spirituality. And, the idea isn't that, more mysticism is better. You know, my sort of general approach to this is that some degree of mysticism, some acknowledgement of the mystery, let's say, that's out there, is healthy. And, the amount varies based on the individual. The way I see it is that, if we're trying to be a very functional member of society, then if we're too much of a mystic, that sort of will work against us. But if we're facing a terminal illness, perhaps transcending some of the ego towards a more mystic realm and experience might be beneficial. And I think a lot of the studies are showing that. And so I was wondering if you can tell me what your view and definition is on spirituality. Like that's one of the things that I also am sort of learning as I go. How do I define spirituality, both from perhaps your personal viewpoint and then where the neuroscience of it is?
Yeah. So, I mean, how I would describe spirituality is, what it's based in is a connection to something greater than yourself. And so I think it's finding a locus of your experience that's not dependent on your individual identity. And so I think spirituality consists of different practices and tools and techniques to try to stabilize yourself in something bigger. And that something bigger it can be nature, it could be completely in this physical realm, or it could be God, or it could be, Brahma or your Buddha nature or whatever you want it to be, right? Some kind of transcendent concept that goes beyond individuals. And so I think spirituality is somewhat connecting to that greater sense of connectedness. And yeah, and things like meditation, breath work, or sensory deprivation or psychedelics allow us to kind of relax this kind of internal narrative. I am this person who is distinct from the rest of the world and other people, and connect to that more expansive mode of being. And I think true spirituality is then integrating that mode of being into everyday life. It's not necessarily sitting in a cave and meditating and just being in blissful realms all the time. It's like, okay, come back to the marketplace, come back to the world, with this perspective, maintaining and like with like the like kind of like a bodhisattva type of viewpoint of bringing that realization into the material, into the world. Um, so that's how I mean how I construe spirituality. And in terms of the neuroscience and the research, you know, it's measured in different ways. I think there's a lot more emphasis on spiritual experiences rather than spirituality itself per se, just because it's such a nebulous concept, like how it's difficult to scientifically pin down. And so, you know, there are a lot of questionnaires and assessments have been developed over the years looking at spiritual type experiences, either induced by psychedelics or not. It's often also called self-transcended experiences or peak experiences. Sometimes there's questionnaires that focus on awe, experiences of awe, which are kind of a proxy for spiritual experiences. So yeah, so that's generally how it's looked at or defined.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that was a very beautiful definition. And what you alluded to, that balance between, sort of being present in society, being a productive, functional member, that's sort of that healthy balance that I also think is the way to go for most people. So, when people have these mystical type experiences, is there anything distinct in, let's say, someone being in the psychedelic state, you have this interconnectedness from a neuroscientific perspective. Is there a distinction between the mystical state on psychedelics and, let's say, a non-mystical state, or is the psychedelic state, the one that you've been describing, just by its nature, a mystical state?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It comes down to how we define mystic state, right? And in the research, strictly speaking, mystical experiences are a particular type of experience. And you can have 10 psychedelic experiences without having a mystical experience, right? In this context, the concept of a mystical experience is defined as one with certain dimensions, right? And the core dimension is an experience of unity, an experience of oneness, the feeling like your individual boundaries are dissolved and you're one with either the universe around you or this kind of eternal infinite void within yourself. And so the unitive aspect is the core feature. But that's not enough for the mystical experience. Like that unitive I just described, that could be ego dissolution of just dissolving your sense of individuality. That's not necessarily mystical. The mystical comes in when you get this profound joy or euphoria or bliss that comes up, a deep feeling of sacredness, a deep feeling of what's called the noetic quality, which is a quality that you're gaining kind of deep insight into the nature of things. And often feeling like you're transcending space and time entirely. And also the experience can't be encapsulated in words. It's ineffable. And so kind of mystical experience is this particular constellation of things that seem to co-occur in certain cases at certain points for a certain period of time during psychedelic experiences, but also, you know, it can happen in nature if you're in the Grand Canyon and you're just so taken aback by it. It can happen spontaneously during meditation. You know, a lot of meditative practices are aimed at creating the kind of conditions for that to arise, and so on. But so yeah, I would say mystical experiences are those specifically. And the psychedelic experience is like a whole variety of types of experiences beyond that as well.
And do we have any data or evidence on, like, how it looks differently in the neuroscience of it, like the mystical state versus the other sort of states?
It's a really good question. We're not quite there yet. That's something that we would love to try to look at more. Like for example, like having something in the scanner and somehow having them convey to us, oh, like at this time, you know, I'm having a mystical experience right now. But like you can see how that's kind of silly because if you're in a mystical experience, you're not gonna be thinking to respond on some computer or press a button because like you are the computer and the button, you are everything. There is no anything, right? So it's really tricky to know that. But I would imagine that there is, you know, a signature brain state or set of states that occur more often during those experiences than not. And there there are ways you can potentially look at that in the neuroscience, but you know, we can only speculate right now. And so a lot of the speculation is stuff like, you know, the default mode network becoming reduced in this activity, which is corresponds to our mental narratives or story of who we are and how the world will.
Seems to be a bit of a lag again.
I'd like to jump in and just take advantage of this time over here and just thank everyone for joining. Also, if you have any questions for Dr. Houman or Dr. Manish, the chat box is there. And you're more than welcome to share your questions in the chat. I'm sure we'll have enough time towards the end of this conversation to attend to them. But yeah, I just thought I'd take advantage of this brief gap that we have over here.
Thank you so much. I think the internet connection is having a bit of a mystical experience, and naturally so. It's one of the things that has been talked about is sort of these psychedelic experiences disrupting technology at times, including when we play music or record, we usually prefer to have a more analog system in place to avoid technological glitches. Um,
There's a small, I think that's the issue. 1 second.
yeah, so
Got that? We're all good.
perfect.
Okay,
I'll come back.
am I back? Can you see me? Yeah, sorry
Yeah,
about that. Why it's happening. Um,
no worries. I was saying there's some sort of mystical experience
uh,
taking place in the network connection.
right, yeah, totally. Getting the vibes are getting too high. It's messing with the electromagnetic frequencies, you know. Um, what was I saying? I was describing the types of mystical experiences.
Yeah, no, I
Um,
think what you said was interesting. You know, ultimately, it's hard to study,
mhm.
an individual if they're in the mystical state. It's hard to know. I think, we'll get there, but I guess we have work to do.
Yeah, yeah. It comes down to finding ways to measure what experience somebody's having without intruding on that experience and perturbing it. That's like the quintessential question in all this research is how to do that. And we're still trying to figure out ways to do that, minimally disruptive ways of asking people or finding out what they're experiencing.
Exactly. I know from the talks that you've given us, in terms of, what we postulate is going on, like why do we have this sort of capacity? I know you mentioned in the past things of like we're hacking into like an existing system, perhaps links to trauma, like a post-traumatic state. Can you elaborate a little bit on that part?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, there are variety of ways we can speculate on that. Like one idea related to psychedelics is that um, the serotonin 2A receptor system that psychedelics work through is in our brain because it mediates our ability to change ourselves in the context of intense aversive circumstances. So it's an inbuilt change system which promotes plasticity, it promotes new behaviors, new ways of thinking to help us deal with an intense issue that's facing us that we need some new response to. We need to adapt to in a new way. And so psychedelics hack that system by putting us in that state without in the absence of an acute thing that's happening necessarily. And so we can think of mystical experiences of oneness, of dissolution of everything as just the pinnacle of that, of just like letting go of all of our preconceived notions and concepts and ideas into this kind of transcendent, kind of unitive place, which then just kind of resets our system in a unique way of leaving ourselves and coming back. And so, I mean, that would be kind of the naturalistic kind of bringing it into science perspective on it. It's like, yeah, it's this like radical reset of dissolving all sense of what we know and who we are, to then come out on the other side with a new outlook, a new fresh outlook. But some might say, that's just like reducing it to biology and getting rid of the mystery of it, and can't be true in the end. But that's a hypothesis or a theory.
Right. So the study participants that you mentioned that you're doing these studies on, these are healthy volunteers, right?
In our studies, yeah, we're looking at healthies.
Great. So I guess what I'm wondering is like looking at the research done on patients that are getting, psilocybin assisted therapy or other forms of therapy, it seems that this correlation with the mystical state and positive outcomes has been reproduced over and over. Is that true? And if so, how do we explain that from a scientific perspective?
Yeah. So it's interesting. So I think there's been seven, somewhere between 6 and 8 clinical trials looking at psilocybin for depression. And I think 6 out of 8 or something like this. I think there are 2 or 3 studies which just straight up did not find a correlation between mystical experiences and getting better, but the rest found it. And so that suggests, like, yes, it's an important factor for a lot of people, but it's not the end all be all, right? It's not necessary. It could be sufficient in certain cases, but it's not necessary. Um, and the stance that we take as scientists is that, we put our metaphysical assumptions to the side and think and look at, like, people are having this very real experience. Like, this is a fact that they have these experiences. What it means, the significance of it, that's like not the realm of science. The fact is they're having these experiences. How can we characterize them scientifically using a scientific method and quantify them and then correlate that with other quantified measures like clinical outcomes, like depression scales. And so in these cases, it's just characterizing it as another phenomenon that occurs and then correlating it with reductions in depression. And so that's how, again, these things, they have the mystical experience questionnaire, which is often used, which asks questions related to what I said before, related to experiences of unity, of bliss, of sacredness, of ineffability, of all these things. And so that correlates significantly in a lot of studies, but not all studies.
Very interesting. Do you know these clinical trials that you mentioned? I guess they're all using the same questionnaire because my understanding is there's the mystical experience questionnaire, which is probably the oldest one around that's evolved over the years. And then there are newer ones that are developed like in Europe and such. Are all these studies using the mystical experience questionnaire, or some of them are using like the European correlates?
Yeah, there is some variability there. So the mystical experience questionnaire is most associated with Johns Hopkins University, and it comes out of that milieu. And then in Europe, a lot of them use what's called the 5-dimensional altered states of consciousness questionnaire, or 11-dimensional. And that has this measured subscale called the oceanic boundlessness, which is basically feeling like, you're boundless and you're merging with all things and you're infinite. And so that is a measure of mystical experiences without using mystical or spiritual language, right? And so that's often used, and it correlates with the mystical experience questionnaire. If you collect them both in the same study, they correlate, but not perfectly, some difference. And so in Europe, a lot of them use that kind of more agnostic scale, because there's a lot of criticism of the mystical experience questionnaire. And actually, I even co-authored a paper where we're criticizing it. And I know my supervisor, Robin, doesn't like it too much either, because it's kind of loaded. It's, the questionnaire itself is called mystical experience questionnaire. And to give it to somebody kind of puts words in their mouth. It kind of, there might be a kind of ambiguous, relatively neutral experience. And then you're getting the scale, and it's like, oh, maybe that was mystical. And it's kind of telling you what your experience was like and creating a framework. And people are very suggestible, generally. And they're like, oh, maybe that was what I was experiencing. And so, I think there's an effort to create scales that are less biased towards a particular framing of the experience. And arguably calling it a mystical experience questionnaire and using that kind of language is kind of suggesting itself onto people, if that makes sense. And so there is critique there.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad you brought that up. And it's true, the reality is we are very suggestible in that state. And yeah, like I could see the bias there. And I know that there was some criticism on the Johns Hopkins group and how there may have been like a religious sort of tone in some of the work that's been done. Um, there's a question in the chat talking about research done with particular strains, differences between strains. Um, to start with that one, in Canada, we've been treating patients under the Special Access Program. The first few patients were treated under a different program where the patients would actually have the option to somehow from the black market obtain their own mushrooms or grow them. And so the strain that we used most during that period was the Golden Teacher. But I know there are a lot of strains out there now, different potencies. And in many of the studies, we're actually using psilocybin milligram dosing. I think most of the studies are done with synthetic psilocybin, but we do have options for botanical extracts. And so in Canada and in the Special Access Program, we've been using both synthetic and the botanical extract, which has some of the sort of other chemicals in the mushroom for a potential entourage effect. And I know that there was the recent rodent study that showed maybe there's some improvement in the efficacy with the natural product. I'm wondering if you can just comment on all of that.
Yeah, it's all really interesting. I mean, in humans, there's no systematic study looking at different strains and whether they affect the experience in ways that are like above and beyond just potency, right? Because we all know strains vary in their potency. You have golden teachers, but then you have things like penis envies and a whole variety of other strains, which can range by 2x or more in terms of psilocybin content. And so, but I think a lot of people, when they talk about strains, they're not talking about potency. They're talking about different, like one is more emotional, one is more spiritual, one is more this or that. That hasn't been, systematically studied in humans yet, so we don't quite know. A lot of researchers think a lot of that is placebo and expectation, because if you look into the details of what secondary alkaloids are present in these mushrooms, just things like baeocystin, norbaeocystin, um, erugacin, and maybe some hormonal alkaloids. Most of these are not psychoactive. They're metabolized by the body and not even getting to the brain, or are not active in the brain. And so it's unclear whether an entourage effect is real. And I know a lot of very reputable researchers who've been in this field for decades who think it's not a thing. But that rodent study you mentioned is really interesting because they did find there seemed to be an improved antidepressant effect in the full spectrum extract as opposed to just the synthetic psilocybin. And so it's interesting. We don't know. These are open questions in the field.
Great, thanks. A follow-up question on there is, are participants starting in a fasted state? From my experience, we do require at least multiple hours of a fast, like 3 to 4 hours. We do allow for a light breakfast. The sessions are usually done in the day. Some patients opt to fast for longer. I'm wondering how does it work with your studies?
Yeah, very similar. Like have a light breakfast, and no caffeine in the morning. And usually, participants haven't eaten for about 3 hours by the time they get there. But what's interesting is that in our studies, towards the end of the day, we allow them to have snacks if they're really hungry. But ahead of the experience, we ask for 3 hours-ish of not eating, and only a light breakfast.
Yeah, exactly. Same with us. A lot of times patients, even in the middle of their experience, want to have some snacks. And
Mhm.
another way, like towards the end, we try to even have, especially if it's a group therapy experience, we try to have like a group snacking session. It's a really great way to integrate. And I know that sometimes we can even use mindfulness practices with eating. During one of the group sessions we did, our mutual friend Kyle Greenway, he sort of guided a patient mindfulness eating practices using the blueberries, and it resulted in a profound experience. Um,
Nice.
yeah, so the last question there is precursors to different experiences. I'm not sure what that means, but perhaps we're talking about the concept of sort of set and setting, perhaps. Is there any neuroscience to that? Let's say just talking about the concept of the importance of our mindset going into an experience, and sort of the setting that we're doing it in. Going back to this notion of psychedelics being non-specific amplifiers, is that something that's backed by neuroscience?
Um, yes and no. I mean, there hasn't been a direct systematic study of it yet using neuroscience and psychology of investigating the effect of set and setting. We actually just started one though. We just actually started the first ever one here at UCSF of systematically looking at set and setting on experiences, on outcomes, and also using EEG and fMRI. So it's a massive study that we just started literally 2 weeks ago, which is going to be ongoing for at least a couple of years actually. And so that, actually looking at directly, we're kind of pioneering that. But outside of that, you know, so psychedelics mainly work through the serotonin system and the serotonin 2A. And something with serotonin that it mediates is our sensitivity to our environment. So even SSRIs do this, actually. There's evidence suggesting that SSRIs increase serotonin activity, and this increases environmental sensitivity. So you're sensitive to people you're around, what you're doing, etc. And psychedelics do this to a much greater degree. And so it is based on serotonin and neurobiology. It makes sense that setting play a huge role in which direction the psychedelic experience goes. And more broadly in the psychological research, one of the biggest predictors of having a positive and more mystical experience is being able to surrender and let go. So if you are able to surrender and let go of your day's concerns and just really be in the experience and going into it to the fullest, that's correlated with more mystical experiences and more positive experiences.
I guess just reflecting on what you're describing and what we talked about earlier with the criticism on, let's say, something like the mystical experience questionnaire, it seems like it is a good thing to have that sort of experience, but I guess as researchers, our duty is to be more neutral and so to not to like sort of seed, let's say, a certain idea in our research participants. But it seems like from a more personal level, that's something that you are interested in. You think it's a good thing, the mystical experience.
Yeah, no, exactly. And like empirically, it seems to be the case that it helps people, right? And so and often mystical experiences, yeah, coincide with better benefits in general. It's not associated with the worst benefits, right? So it's a positive thing it's considered a positive thing to induce. Um, and one other thing I want to mention, which is really interesting, is this is with ketamine, so slightly different than what we're talking about, but maybe you saw this study, um, where they changed people's media exposure the day before they took ketamine, and people who had more, were on their phones more and more social media exposure, more technology use, had kind of like dystopian technological themed visions under ketamine, which really just took them in a very particular direction. Whereas people who didn't have that media exposure did not and had a very different experience. And so this just suggests that, whatever is active in your psyche, whatever you're putting into your brain and your mind in the day or week before an experience is going to influence what comes up, very likely. And so it just speaks to being very conscious of that, whether you're trying to bias yourself towards a mystical experience or not, or just trying to have more of a neutral experience or whatever, it's really important to take that into consideration.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That's definitely part of our preparation process, is sort of paying attention to what we're feeding into our stream of consciousness. And for sure, I mean, ketamine is the agent that we're using primarily at Mystic Health. And that's one of the things I always speak to patients about is, sort of planting the right seeds before going into the experience. And then part of it is with perhaps not getting exposed to things that won't necessarily be positive. Um, I'm wondering if we can talk a bit about meditation, sort of the link between meditation and psychedelics, and where our understanding is at this time.
Yeah, there's been some interesting research done actually at the intersection of psychedelics and meditation. There's this one study done at the University of Zurich, and they actually made a really great documentary about it. I can't remember what the name is off the top of my head, but it's something like coming down from the mountain or something like this. Anyway, so what they did was they had people on a 7 day Zen meditation retreat, and on day 4, half the people got a high dose of psilocybin, half them got placebo. And they found that the people who got psilocybin, big surprise, had deeper experiences of ego dissolution and mystical states, and were able to deepen their meditation practice through it. And when they measured their brain, I think 2 weeks after the retreat was over, they had changes in their default mode network that the other group didn't have while they were meditating. And so, and they had more positive benefits from the retreat. So that study showed very directly that, psilocybin was able to deepen their meditative practice in that context with long-lasting brain and psychological changes, positive ones. And and then there's been other work. Actually, there's another interesting study, this one done at Johns Hopkins, where they had people engage in a 6-month long set of spiritual practices, and they had people who did a lot of spiritual practices and who didn't do too much. Where spiritual practices meant they were working through this book on meditation, they were doing journaling, they were doing mantra and like other practices throughout their day, and kind of reflecting on spiritual values. And again, the group that received a high dose of psilocybin, had more compliance. They meditated a lot more. They engaged in their spiritual practice a lot more. They were more motivated to do it, and they had more positive benefits. And so, it seems to be the case that psychedelics either enhance meditation practice or kind of move people towards deepening it, or like create greater motivation in doing it. And then also, I think what you're kind of alluding to, I know this is an interest of yours, is how psychedelic effects on the brain are similar to meditation effects on the brain. And one link that's often made is related to default mode network, particularly this part of the brain called the posterior cingulate cortex, which is a core part of the default mode network, and is reliably reduced in meditators when they're meditating. And it's one of the areas that is most affected by psychedelics, actually, in terms of reducing alpha brain waves there, but also reducing activity there. And so that could be, correspond to a quieting of our internal chatter and mental dialogue, which then creates more spaciousness and equanimity. And so I think there are a lot of correspondences there.
Amazing. Yes, for sure. We're trying to sort of implement mindfulness practices as a core part of our therapeutic framework in this practice, and it's been really helpful for me personally, using meditation as a tool in self-discovery and healing, and also to witness that in many of my patients. I'm wondering, we only have a few minutes left. Um, you've been doing this for a number of years, and I've seen a lot of amazing videos posted by you just explaining things. And for those that don't follow you, the Psychedelic Scientist, please follow at the Psychedelic Scientist on YouTube and Instagram. I'm just wondering, like, if you were to sort of summarize where you see psychedelics, like in the field of therapy and beyond, like, how do you think we should be approaching psychedelics? I know there's a lot of stigma against it. There's a lot of fear. We had the recent backlash with the FDA not approving MDMA. But how can we come to this from like a rational, scientific perspective? And are psychedelics something that you see being part of the medical system moving forward? And if so, like how?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question because there are a lot of ways that psychedelics challenge existing models of healthcare and kind of medical approaches and approaches to treating mental illness and everything like that. And um, you know, one of the things with psychedelics is that, as I mentioned before, they're these profound experiential medicines. They're not something, they're not like an SSRI where you just get prescribed and you go home and take it. They're based on a limited number of profound, deep experiences which create lasting change. And the idea that the experience matters and that maybe the psychotherapeutic aspect of it, in addition to the drug, matters is challenges psychiatry, right? And challenges the FDA because the FDA doesn't regulate therapy. They regulate drugs, and they regulate drugs that you can take and not know you've taken it because it has to be blinded in the studies. And so psychedelics really challenge a lot of things. But I think rather than rejecting psychedelics because they don't fit into existing frameworks, we need to learn from psychedelics on how existing frameworks are inadequate and how they could be developed and innovated and kind of brought into the 21st century. Because a lot of drug evaluation protocols, like the randomized controlled trials, started in around 1962 or three as a response to, thalidomide, which is a morning sickness drug, which caused all sorts of birth defects. Anyway, it's been 60 years that we've had the same model and psychedelics challenge it. And so what I really want to see moving forward is psychedelics heralding this greater recognition of experiential medicines and of these combined pharmacotherapy, psychotherapy approaches and of innovations happening in the FDA and in kind of NIH's conception of psychiatric drugs, et cetera, and moving that forward. So I think they do represent a very different means of treating mental illness that is sorely needed, and but it needs to be integrated into these kind of systems.
Thank you. That was very insightful. And that brings to me the question of microdosing. The way I sort of see microdosing is a little bit like SSRIs, where you have this like small stimulus over time. What are your thoughts on microdosing? I know the evidence isn't strong, but
Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, I think it's still early stages for that. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of anecdotal reports of people reporting all sorts of benefits from it. I think those are real. People are experiencing benefits, but how much is that is placebo and actual drug effect is an open question. But the bottom line is, in real life, people, it doesn't matter. It's like it's helping people, right? That's what matters. And there's emerging research that it does have very real brain effects that are somehow similar to macro doses, full doses. And there's some preliminary evidence that neuroplasticity might be increased as well. And so I think there's a lot of potential there. And I think if, and I'm very much for it because even if it is administered in a model like SSRIs where you take it indefinitely on some kind of schedule, probably wouldn't take it every day, but like 3 days a week, 4 days a week, it's much better because you don't get all the side effects. And it seems to allow people to be more present in their lives, to be more aware, and as opposed to just numbing the symptoms and being able to function. Like how I think about it is it promotes well-being rather than reducing symptoms. Right. I think that's an important distinction. And so I think there's a lot of potential there, but in terms of the research, we need a lot more.
thank you. And on that, is this concern for valvular heart disease something that we should be worried about? Is there strong evidence indicating that?
Currently, no, not really. It's kind of like the claim is being made on a mechanistic basis. It's like, oh, psychedelics hit the 5-HT2B receptor, which modulates the heart, and other drugs which modulate that have created arrhythmias and valvulopathies, etc. But there's not really. I think for people without pre-existing cardiovascular vulnerabilities, it's very minimal concern. The amount of stimulation you're getting is not that much. It's very minimal. And ideally, people are taking breaks from microdosing here and there. They're not taking it every day a week for years and years. It's like people, have day off days. They might have an off week here and there. And there's no reports in literature of people actually getting it. It's purely theoretical. So I think it's always good to be cautious, but I don't see that as a major concern.
Amazing. Manish, thank you so much. That was such a rich discussion.
Yeah.
Always learn from you, and I really look forward to the research that you're doing and all that you're contributing to the field. Uh,
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks so
yeah,
much.
yeah,
Thanks
thanks
for
for
having
coming.
me.
We're gonna have a recording up for this. We do have a mailing list if people want to join to stay aware of all our webinars. Thanks again, Manish, and see you soon,
Yeah.
hopefully.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah. Take care. Bye bye, everyone.